prohibition and war on drugs like policies in Mexico have done nothing to prevent drug use, have done nothing to decrease the number or the power of criminal organizations dedicated to illicit trafficking and to other crimes. And it had done nothing to prevent corruption and to help people not being victimized or improve their health or improve their living or their livelihoods even for people who are involved in the cultivation of cannabis or poppy, for example, because in Mexico we have both declared illicit crops. So to us, drug policy reform, it's not a matter of just legalizing cannabis because we think of the rights of people who use drugs. To us, it's a matter of survival. For Mexico, it's a key issue that we can end the policy that in the first place created the illegality that then empowered drug cartels, that then created this unsustainable violence that is affecting our country and that is preventing our law enforcement to actually focus on resolving and punishing the crimes that are affecting the most our society. That is homicide, that is kidnapping, that is sexual abuse and other crimes, because they're way too much focused on prosecuting, arresting, ending the lives of people that are found with small amounts of cannabis and other drugs. So for us, again, it's a matter of human rights, it's a matter of advancing a policy that has not been effective, but it's also a matter of life and death. We need to end the cycle of violence in Mexico, and to do that, we need to end prohibition. It starts with embracing harm reduction as that particular approach that will allow us to understand what is that we want as policy outputs, as results, and what do we want to actually provide for our communities. So the gradual steps that we need to take as societies to advance cannabis reform and to advance drug policy reform at large are, for example, decriminalizing possession and use of all drugs, starting with cannabis. We also need to create regulatory frameworks that are more just and that are more equitable and that are more focused on creating the necessary conditions in our communities, within our communities, so we can better address health issues, mental health issues, housing issues, inequality issues, race, gender issues that are the root cause for social suffering and therefore can take us to other problems such as addiction or such as problematic substance use. After decriminalizing use and decriminalizing possession, we also need to create legal markets that are sensitive not only to the needs of the community, but that are balanced in terms of the policy outcomes that they want to achieve. We need to strike the right balance between having strict regulation for protecting children and the most vulnerable groups, but we also need to have flexible enough regulations so we're not creating entry barriers, for example, for most affected communities or racialized communities who will not be able to participate in the legal market if we do otherwise. We also need to have a balanced regulation that will take into account that, yes, we need to generate profit for those who want to participate in that particular market, but we also need to be reinvesting some of those resources into our communities, and we also need to direct some of those resources into just having better services in general and addressing the needs of the communities in a better way. We also need to include a gender perspective into this, so we can take into account the special and specific needs of women or sexual and gender identity minorities that are involved also in cannabis and that were excluded traditionally from several activities and that were excluded particularly from the profits of the market and the benefits of the regulation. We also need to have sensitive policies when it comes to understanding what are the drivers of use and production of other substances. We need to understand that even if drug policy reform started with cannabis reform, it cannot end with cannabis legalization. It needs to go further and include this social justice perspective and human rights perspective, also when dealing with users of other substances, also when dealing with other substances, and also when dealing with other criminalization practices from the state and from the market in general. So I think what we need is to just take gradual steps, starting with decrim, starting with depenalizing several conducts that are still penalized, and then evolving into regulated markets that take into account the perspectives of human rights, harm reduction, public health, and that are also balanced so we can maximize the public value that these regulated markets can provide to our communities, and not make it just for-profit markets that will replicate again the wrongs of prohibition and the harms to our communities and to special populations. The declared objectives of the international drug control regime that allowed for countries to start prohibiting substances and to start opting for drug war-like policies was to eliminate from the face of the earth drug consumption and to eliminate drug production. So that zero goal, to have zero drugs, zero drug users, actually allowed in the drug convention signed at the UN for governments to start taking measures that were more aggressive than the measures that were originally written down in those conventions. That is, if the objective was to reach a zero production goal, governments started not only doing enforced eradication, but they started doing it with dangerous chemical products that started creating other problems on the ground. For example, we started getting communities sick because of the nocive effect of these products. We started to have a shortage of food because of we were affecting the food chains with eradication. We started having environmental problems because we were fumigating, but we were also eradicating and moving then productions from regular zones to tropical forest and protected natural areas to avoid law enforcement and to avoid eradication. And the same happened with the use of substances. If we had a zero consumption goal that was supposed to be achieved by prohibiting plant-based drugs such as cannabis, such as poppy and opium, or such as coca leaf and then cocaine, the market itself, it started creating new synthetic drugs that we know less of, that we had less evidence of, and that people started using without having enough knowledge or science behind of what the effects were of consuming these particular substances, without having access to services for quality control or drug checking or even therapies in case you developed a problematic use of these particular substances. So we started pushing also people use drugs to riskier substances at the same time that we were pushing them into illegality and clandestine environments to also avoid detentions and arrests from law enforcement that at some point started to treat these zero consumption goal not as a public health goal, but also as a security goal, in the sense that the threat was no longer the substance, but the people and the person using the substance. So they needed to put that people away. And we started also doing massive incarceration, and we started doing massive criminalization. So that is to say that even if there was a legitimate worry about drug consumption and drug production, the fact that we set an unreachable goal of zero production and zero use allowed for governments to take aggressive actions that were beyond what was written in the conventions and that caused more harm than the good that we achieved. It goes without saying that the world has never reached a zero consumption, zero production goal at any time. But what we created was more substances, more harmful substances, more activities and conducts that were penalized and actively prosecuted and enforced. We started creating internal conflict because by declaring drugs prohibited, we basically created a black market and we created criminal opportunities for criminal actors to start engaging in the illicit trafficking and the production of these substances. So we advanced and we enabled internal conflict in producing and transit countries, and we also allowed for militarized responses to the drug phenomena that increased violence in countries like Mexico, for example, with the narrative of going super tough on drugs and not allowing drugs to be trafficked to the United States, for example. With what we started doing was militarizing our ports, militarizing our borders, militarizing our police forces at the municipal and state level, and militarizing the territory in general. In 2006, Mexico only had one permanent operation of the military in the state of Tamaulipas. By 2023, we have permanent military operations in the 32 states of Mexico that are costing millions in public spending without actually reaching any particular goal in the sense that we're not having better security, we're not having less violence, we're not having less drugs, and we're not having less illicit trafficking to the US either. That fueled corruption, fueled conflict, fueled violence, fueled human rights violations, arbitrarity from the authority, but did not much or anything at all to actually solve the public health problem that was perceived drugs were causing back in 1961. So setting those goals as the objective of public policy basically hindered public policy to have a more comprehensive manner and ways of dealing with the drug phenomena, whether it was in its health dimension or its development dimension or its security and peace dimension. So what we're hoping to do with drug policy reform is to correct those wrongs and start focusing on what is that we really want as policy outcomes in each of the dimensions of the drug phenomena. If legal regulation of cannabis and perhaps other substances is done correctly in Mexico and the US, what we expect to see is the improvement of the livelihood of many families that for so long were either captured by an illicit economy or they were left with no possibilities to actually have an economic activity that will help them support their families and have an income to survive. So that is one of the positive outcomes that we're expecting, is for rural development and the improvement of the quality of life of people that were involved in the cultivation of illicit crops, of cannabis in particular, and that their livelihoods are better off. One of the other things that we expect is to see the prison population decrease. We expect to have a more rational use of our criminal justice system that will only focus on prosecuting the crimes that are really harmful to society and not necessarily focuses on prosecuting young people for simple possession of a substance that's not even lethal, like cannabis. We also expect to have less distortions in public spending. and to reorient most of the resources that we dedicate now to fight the war on drugs to actually have better health and education services that are free of stigma and that are actually sharing evidence-based information about cannabis use, but also about cannabis production and the cannabis market in general. We also expect to have better statistics and better indicators, and hopefully with those better indicators, more segmented and targeted policies that are addressing the specific needs of different groups. And we will also expect to have less violence and less conflict in Mexico because, or as a result of less empowered criminal organizations and more focused and efficient use of our limited law enforcement resources.